May 1940, on a shell-bitten farm lane west of the Somme, Lance Corporal Edward Carver is lying in a drainage ditch with the most hated weapon in his platoon pressed into his shoulder. It is not a cannon. It is not a machine gun. It is a rifle. But it weighs 36 pounds unloaded, fires a .55 caliber steel cord round, and kicks so violently that grown men joked about drawing lots before training with it. The platoon calls it the mule gun, not because it carries anything, because it kicks like one. And now 3 German light tanks are moving down the lane toward him. Carver can feel the vibration in the mud under his elbows. He can hear the tracks grinding over broken stone. Behind him, British infantry are trying to fall back before the road closes. There is no anti-tank gun in position, no friendly armor, no time. Only Carver, a ditch, and a rifle almost everyone believed was a cruel joke. The lead Panzer II turns slightly as it enters the open stretch. Carver waits until the front plate is square in his sight. He does not aim like a man trying to scare a tank. He aims like a man trying to find one weak place in a machine that was never supposed to fear him. He squeezes the trigger. The rifle drives back into him hard enough to tear the breath out of his chest. Dirt jumps from the ditch wall. For 1 second, he cannot see anything but dust. Then the lead tank stops. Not slows. Stops. A thin line of smoke pushes out from the engine deck. One hatch snaps open. Then another. Men spill out of the vehicle faster than discipline can hold them. Carver works the bolt with shaking hands. The 2nd Panzer tries to reverse. Its driver has just learned something his training never made room for. That ordinary infantry might not be ordinary. Carver fires again. The shot slams into the turret face. The tank lurches back at an angle, blind and panicked. The 3rd tank does not wait to understand the physics. It disappears behind the bend. The mule gun has done the one thing nobody trusted it to do. It has made tanks hesitate. That is the part of the boy's anti-tank rifle that vehicle tallies never measured. Not just what it destroyed, what it made German crews believe might happen next. The boy's rifle entered British service in 1937, named after Captain Henry C. Boys of the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. On paper, it was a brutally simple answer to a terrifying new problem. Give infantry a weapon they could carry, and give that weapon enough velocity to bite into light armor. It fired a 55-inch round, about 13.9 millimeters, with a hardened steel core. The projectile left the barrel at nearly 900 meters per second. At close range, under the right angle, it could punch through around 20 millimeters of armor plate. Those numbers mattered because early German light tanks were not the steel monsters they later became. A Panzer II could carry roughly 14 to 20 millimeters of armor in vulnerable places. German armored cars and half-tracks were softer still. Even the early Panzer III, with about 30 millimeters on the front, had flanks and weak points that made crews uneasy once the threat was understood. But the men who had to carry the boys did not think in neat specification sheets. They thought about weight, the 5-round magazine, the long barrel, the bipod, the awkward bulk, the padded shoulder stock that promised mercy and delivered only a little. They thought about the recoil, because the boys did not simply fire. It punished the man firing it. Range stories spread faster than confidence. Men said it bruised shoulders black. Men said it knocked riflemen backward. Men said the muzzle blast made the whole weapon feel like a private argument with physics. So when British platoons went into France with boys' rifles, many carried them the way desperate men carry bad tools. Not because they loved them, because they had nothing better. And that was enough to make the early war dangerous in a way German armor had not expected. German tank crews in 1940 had been taught to respect artillery, mines, and proper anti-tank guns. They had not been taught to fear a rifle team hidden behind a wall, in a ditch, or under a hedgerow. That assumption was reasonable. A rifle and a tank sound like they belong to different centuries. The tank has armor, tracks, optics, a cannon, a machine gun, and a crew trained to keep moving. The rifle has a man behind it, a second man with ammunition, and a very small number of chances before everyone in the area knows where the shot came from. But battlefield reality does not care what sounds reasonable. At Narvik in Norway, before France had fully collapsed, British troops saw the boys do something German planners would have preferred to call accidental. A round struck a German Neubaufahrzeug, a heavy-looking, multi-turreted tank whose armor was thinner than its silhouette suggested. The shot penetrated around 13 millimeters of plate, killed the driver, and helped set the vehicle on fire. A tank had been stopped by a rifle, not in theory. In snow, smoke, and shock, then came France. The retreat pushed British infantry into exactly the kind of short, ugly contacts the boys had been built for. Farm roads, village corners, roadblocks, thin walls. Tanks appearing suddenly at ranges where armor thickness stopped being an abstract number and became a question of angle, distance, and nerve. At Arras, on May 21, 1940, British counterattacking forces used boys-equipped infantry alongside armor and field guns. Afterward, German analysts had to sort through reports that did not fit their expectations. Some tank damage, first blamed on proper anti-tank guns, had come from large-caliber rifles carried by infantry. That correction mattered. Because once the Germans accepted that British infantry positions might contain anti-tank rifles, every advance toward those positions became more expensive in the mind before it became expensive in steel. A hedgerow could hide one. A barn wall could hide one. A ditch could hide one. A few riflemen who had looked harmless from inside a turret could suddenly be something else. The boys' teams paid for that fear with danger of their own. A two-man team was clumsy by design. One man fired. One man spotted, loaded, carried extra ammunition, and watched for the response that always came too fast. They could not shoot and lounge in place. The first shot announced them. The second shot gambled that the enemy was still disorganized. After that, the air around them usually filled with machine guns' fur, mortar fragments, or tank shells, sent at the patch of earth where the muzzle flash had appeared. The rifle's power came with a brutal rule: fire, move, or be crushed. Carver learned that rule after his second shot, when the ditch around him began to tear open. The German crews had retreated, but the infantry behind them had not. Bullets stitched the grass. A round struck the rim of the ditch and sprayed mud across his face. His loader grabbed the ammunition box with one hand and Carver's sleeve with the other. They crawled backward through drainage water, dragging the rifle between them like a piece of farm machinery stolen from a giant. For the rest of that day, Carver's shoulder throbbed every time he raised his arm. By evening, the bruise had spread down his chest, but men who had laughed at the mule gun no longer laughed the same way. Not because the weapon had become pleasant, because it had become useful. And in 1940, useful was a high form of mercy. The strangest thing about the boys was that its reputation soon grew larger than its actual power. British infantry did not carry unlimited numbers of them. They were heavy, unpopular, and difficult to keep fed with ammunition during a retreat. Many were lost, abandoned, or left behind when units broke contact. But German reports began treating British infantry positions as if anti-tank rifle coverage might be wider than it really was. That is how fear works in battle. It does not require perfect information. It grows inside uncertainty. If one tank in one column is stopped by a weapon everyone dismissed, the next crew does not ask whether every British platoon has one. They ask whether the ditch ahead has one. That question changed behavior. German tanks became more likely to suppress suspected infantry positions before closing. They used more fire. They spent more time. They treated walls, copses, and roadside cuts with suspicion. The boys did not stop blitzkrieg. It did not reverse the campaign in France. It did not turn British infantry into tank killers on command. But it put a cost into the German mind that had not been there before. Doubt. And doubt slows men who were trained to keep moving. The stories that followed only widened that doubt. One rifleman on the retreat from Arras was reportedly handed a boys because someone had noticed he was a good marksman. He had barely handled the weapon before. They pushed him up onto a bank where he could see approaching armor. He fired, and the recoil threw him down so hard the men below had to help him back into position. The physical comedy of it would have been funny anywhere else. There, it was not. Because German tank crews watching from the road saw something far more serious than a man being punished by his own weapon. They saw a rifle round hit armor and stop momentum. In Greece, British troops even used the boys against targets it had never been meant to hunt. A sergeant firing from cover is said to have hit a low-flying German aircraft hard enough to send it down smoking. Whether every version of that tale grew in the telling is less important than the lessons soldiers carried from it. The boys was unpredictable enough to be feared, and embarrassing enough to be hated by the people it surprised. That was its second life. Not as a perfect weapon, as a rumor with a steel core. In North Africa, the rifle found a battlefield that gave it more room to breathe. The desert did not forgive mistakes, but it offered distance, sight lines, and targets the boys could still threaten. Italian tankettes, German armored cars, half-tracks, trucks, engines, radiators, soft-skin columns moving under dust. Around Tobruk in 1941, British and Australian defenders worked boys' rifles into layered defenses. Some teams mounted them on vehicles, turning an awkward rifle into a mobile ambush tool. A truck could stop, fire, and move before the enemy response organized itself. That did not make the boys modern. It made it temporarily relevant. Against light armor, against flanks, against vehicles that depended more on speed than thickness, the old rifle still had teeth. But war does not stand still for weapons that barely work. By 1942, German armor had thickened beyond the boys' comfort. Frontal plates on medium tanks laughed at what early light armor had feared. The remaining kill shots became close, rare, and dangerous enough that the men attempting them were often gambling their lives for a chance at one vulnerable angle. When the Piat arrived, the boys was pushed aside without much ceremony. Few infantrymen mourned the recoil, few missed the weight, few argued that the future belonged to a rifle trying to fight tanks by brute speed alone. And yet, throwing the boys away did not erase what it had done when the war was young. Because in 1940 and 1941, before heavier weapons reached every section, before British infantry had better answers, the boys occupied a narrow, ugly space between helplessness and hope. It was too heavy, too punishing, too quickly outdated. But it arrived early enough to matter. It let a man in a ditch ask a question a German tank crew could not ignore. What if this armor is not enough? Captured German tankers said versions of that question in plain language. Some admitted they had been told British infantry carried anti-tank rifles, but had not believed such weapons could seriously hurt a tank. Once a round came through, belief changed instantly. That is the kind of lesson armor crews remember. A mine teaches one kind of caution. A cannon teaches another. But a rifle round coming from a place that looked harmless teaches something more corrosive. It teaches that the battlefield has hidden teeth. And after that, every hedge is heavier. Every wall has weight. Every ditch becomes a calculation. Carver reached the coast during the evacuation. The mule gun did not. It was too heavy to carry across sand already crowded with men, stretchers, rifles, helmets, smoke, and fear. There was no room for sentimental weapons on small boats under air attack. So he left it where thousands of other objects were left in 1940, in the wreckage of an army getting home any way it could. But men remembered the feeling of it, the bruise, the blast, the shame of hating a weapon that had saved them, the strange respect that came only after it had done something impossible in front of witnesses. The boys' anti-tank rifle was not a great weapon. By the standards of what came later, it was not even a very good one. But greatness was never the point. In the first hard months of the war, British infantry needed something, anything, that could stand in the thin space between a man and a tank. For a little while the boys stood there, and that was enough to change how the enemy looked at the ground ahead. The rifle was heavy. The doubt it left behind was heavier.